welcome to the Books and Music Review Show. This is the Books and Music Review Show, and here's Gerard on a fabulous topic.
Oh, well, thank you for that great introduction. Today we'll be talking a little bit about different landmarks, iconic parts of New York City, and what attracts people from around the world when they come here, but are also really kind of under-publicized gems of the city that the people, the residents, the longtime New Yorkers utilize for all sorts of reasons. One of them is the New York Public Library. The New York Public Library is interesting because it's one of the, for a number of reasons. It's it has one of the largest collections of books that in circulation in the country, and it's used for so many different purposes, not only education but research work. Anyone who's lived in New York or has even visited could attest to how amazing this resource is, and the history behind it is pretty interesting. It was originally started as a endowment from a wealthy philanthropist, John Jacob Astor, who is, a lot of people might know that name, but not really know the story behind his fortune. He was a real estate magnate in the 19th century, and he had a codicil to his will, which provided several $100,000 for the establishment of a public library, and the trustees used this to construct the Astor Library in 1854. And it was a reference library. Its books, you weren't allowed to withdraw its books, so it wasn't really that similar to what you have today. I mean, of course, there are reference libraries still today, which are used primarily for research purposes, and where you can't borrow materials, but there's also but most of the libraries are used for different purposes, taking out and renewing books, now DVDs, CDs, audio visual materials. And the library, it was described in a New York Times editorial as a major reference and research resource, but popular it certainly is not, and so greatly is it lacking in the essentials of a public library that its doors might almost as well be under lock and key for any access the masses of the people can get thereto. So it really was sort of walled off from the general public, not really what we think of when we picture a public library. But that changed pretty well within a few decades. The Lenox Library was incorporated, and that was also created and endowed by a wealthy philanthropist, James Lenox. And he donated his vast collection of Americana artworks, manuscripts, and rare books, including the first Gutenberg Bible in the New World. And again, this was a library that wasn't what we would consider a public library. It charged admission, and a fee for you to access the works inside of the building. And gradually, over the years, people saw the need for a public library to be established. There were already tons of private libraries, and New York was always a literate city with lots of people who were invested in literature. Of course, you had famous poets like Walt Whitman and all sorts of novelists and playwrights, but there really wasn't a way for the average person who's poor to access all of these works of literature. So Samuel Tilden, a former governor and a presidential candidate, bequeathed the bulk of his fortune, about $2.5 million, to establish and maintain a free library and reading room in the city of New York. And this money wasn't touched for years. It was just left there. But eventually the Astor and the Lenox libraries were started to struggle financially. So there was a decision by one of the people who supported a plan to merge the libraries to do something about this. So at the turn of the century, Andrew Carnegie donated $5.5 million, which today would be roughly equivalent to over $100 million, to construct branch libraries all over the city, with the requirement that they be operated and maintained by the city of New York. And this is the first time what became the New York Public Library as we know it became a concrete reality. And the Brooklyn and Queens had already established public libraries, which is why today, if you want to check out a book or use any of the resources in a particular branch library, you have to sign up for a Brooklyn Public Library card or a Queens Public Library card. Manhattan, the New York Public Library covers Manhattan and the Bronx and Staten Island. So this was what this was the basic root of the branch system that we have today. And one of the amazing things about the New York Public Library is how unique each individual branch is. There are so many. You have the central branches, the main branches, which house the biggest collections. In Brooklyn, it's Grand Army Plaza, and Manhattan, you have the Midtown branch, which is undergoing renovation and is slated to reopen sometime, I think, in 2020, within the next 2 years or so. There have been all of these controversies surrounding the renovation, whether or not there was even a lawsuit to prevent them from doing away with the stacks in in the new library. But that's the these main branches are kind of the central, the kind of like the central nervous system for the rest of the network of libraries. But the local branches are where almost all New Yorkers, those are their resources. When they want to take out books or CDs or DVDs or prepare job applications, prepare resumes. That's where most of their work gets done, and they're so unique in a lot of ways. For example, the one in Dongan Hills in Staten Island has this interesting little nook called the Wooseum, which is devoted to the Wu-Tang Clan, a hip hop group that began in Staten Island, and you can see little CDs and biographies of the members of the band, focused on this group that's important to people in the borough. And there are also so many really interesting research libraries in the system. For example, the Schomburg Center, which is dedicated primarily to African American history and literature, where you can find things that aren't available anywhere else. For example, the original manuscripts of some of Phyllis Wheatley's poems. The woman, she was famous for a colonial era poetess who was freed from slavery and became known as one of the most famous black women on the entire planet. Was even saluted and praised by her contemporaries like George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. And you can, I remember I visited the Schomburg when I was in college, and I had to do a research paper on a writer named George Schuyler, who was a protege of H.L. Mencken. He was this really funny, acerbic writer and political pundit who worked for the American Mercury, and he wrote a book called Black No More, where scientists invents a cure for a supposed a kind of a quack scientist invents a cure, a way for black people to change their skin color, and it's kind of a satirization of race relations during the pre-war America, and I couldn't find that book anywhere else, and the rest of the library has kind of unique features depending on what you want to do. There's almost limitless resources if you're a historian or you're writing a book on any aspect of New York or American history. For example, let me just Let me just look for it. There's also a New York. There's also a part of the New York Public Library that's essentially a museum. I forget the name of it, but it's this really amazing branch in Manhattan, which has all sorts of tapestries and really phenomenal works of art that you can't find anywhere else. It's really kind of as I said before, it's kind of a gem in New York City that people I don't think appreciate that much because it's so ubiquitous. There's so many and people who live here kind of have a certain expectation that it'll always be there. What are the something else that's really I think goes unappreciated in New York is the environment. And so, what brought this to mind was when I started to think about the High Line, which is a linear elevated park in Manhattan, on the west side of Manhattan, and it's the initial idea was to take a disused rail line, part of the New York City rail line that served the west side of Manhattan, and it ran through Chelsea and several neighborhoods, and to turn this abandoned hub, a transportation hub, into something that could be used by the entire community. And it was kind of like the New York Library, although on a much smaller scale. It was endowed by certain philanthropists who saw the need for something that would kind of serve as an ecological and social and also kind of historic connecting point for New Yorkers. And it's really kind of amazing when you go to the High Line for the first time and you walk up the steps to this, as I said, what's basically an abandoned rail yard that's been repurposed into a park in the sky, and you're overlooking Chelsea or the West Side, and you're surrounded by all these beautiful plants and flowers, and even little kind of tiny artistic exhibits as you walk down the walk down the rails. You see these kind of interesting little art pieces that people designed with this in mind. This part of New York's history.
If you want the library site.
Oh, thank you. And just going back a minute to the libraries, to the New York Public Library today. Even it's not just not just this kind of inert activity where you sit back and you read a book. There are all sorts of interactive elements, art, photography, even conversations with musicians. For example, this is if you go to the website, you find. I can just pull it up for here. You can find all sorts of exhibitions, like the Power in Print at the Schomburg Center, theater talks also. Cass Sunstein and Samantha Power with David Coe. Can It Happen Here? So that's a discussion between a former diplomat and some former diplomat and I think an ethics advisor for the previous administration, having a conversation about a particular topic that's important, and I think that's one of the great things about the library. It's not just a building filled with books. It's part of the history of New York, and it's kind of the connecting tissue to the future. You have debates about important issues, and you have reflections on the history of America, and I think that's what the two things have in common. This idea that there's the High Line and the public library, they're tying together strands from the past and kind of forcing us to have a conversation about the future, like the fact that a railway that was used that was part of an extremely important commercial hub, and back before the 60s, is now not only a tourist attraction, but an important place for New Yorkers to sit and reflect and walk and kind of appreciate a part of their city that you really don't get a chance to think about when you're in the middle of Manhattan and you're surrounded by noise and lights and just all sorts of distractions. And I think even to a certain extent the museums, something like Museum Maya, where you have museums like the Met and the Museum of Natural History, and even the MoMA to a certain extent, you have places where you can kind of turn off all of the distractions for a couple of hours and think about what it means to live in this city and in this country, and kind of contemplate bigger ideas about art and history and what sort of the basic building blocks of humanity. I mean, that was one of the really amazing things when I was a little kid, and I would go to the Museum of Natural History with my family and see these exhibits from, the Cretaceous period or even before that, and kind of think about what it was like before anyone before there was any skyscrapers or subways or but below the ground where there was basically where there weren't even humans basically, and that it was really kind of an amazing thought. And I think that's one of the things that people don't appreciate about New York City. They kind of picture it as this nonstop, pulsating, just everyone's just going to work or just constantly on the move. They don't have time to sit and reflect on what's happening around them or what happened in the past. But there are so many different. There's so many really amazing historic and cultural institutions that you can take advantage of if you live in New York City and are willing to stop and kind of just stop and think about things that aren't immediately pressing issues that you have to resolve in the next
2.5 minutes.
That you have to resolve immediately. And I think that's what the philanthropists, the people who endowed all of these institutions and donated so much of their wealth and their, in most cases, their personal possessions. I think that's what they were thinking of when they decided to create these institutions. That they wanted people to kind of connect with their history, and even though they spent most of their life just accumulating wealth and making money, through railroads or real estate or oil or extracting natural resources, I think they also had a bigger, more long-term view of what life was about, and like what people needed to do to divorce themselves from these kind of really not so important issues. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and if you are, so most of the people who are listening to this are probably New Yorkers. I would suggest you take advantage of some of these places, be it libraries or museums. Just take advantage of them and read some of the books. Since this is Books and Music Review, and we'll be with you shortly. And until then, enjoy New York and everything it has to offer.